All right, so get this. Today we're going deep on God's dwelling.
Oh, interesting.
Specifically, like how it's shown through the tabernacle and that whole sacrificial system thing in the Old Testament.
Yeah, I see where you're going with this. It's easy to kind of get bogged down with all the like rituals and stuff, but
Right.
the tabernacle is like a physical, a tangible representation of something way deeper, spiritually, I mean.
Totally. And we've got a pretty wild mix of sources for this deep dive. We're talking verses from Exodus, Leviticus, Genesis, Revelation, even like Isaiah, Ezekiel.
Wow.
And even some New Testament stuff too.
Okay.
And like weaving through all of them, it's this massive story of redemption. It's this plan that seems like it was in motion even before, the world even began.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it that way, like a tapestry or something.
Oh, yeah.
Running through all of history with the tabernacle right in the middle, all the rituals, all the sacrifices. They give us this crazy glimpse into how it was all foreshadowed and in the end actually fulfilled.
Okay, so help me unpack this a bit, Riz. We're talking about the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary, the one the Israelites carried around in the desert.
Right.
What made that so special?
Well, think about it from their perspective. It was like literally God's presence among them. Exodus 25.9, it says, God told Moses to build the tabernacle based on a specific pattern he was shown on the mountain. It wasn't just any old tent.
No, definitely not.
It was sacred space, a place for God the Almighty to actually dwell.
So it's less about like the physical tent itself and more about what it stood for. This idea of God wanting to be with his people.
Yeah, exactly.
But then there's also this whole sacrificial system tied to it. What was the point of all those like offerings, all the rituals?
Okay, now that's where things get really interesting. All the different offerings, they're all laid out in Leviticus. They each had their own purpose. Some, like the burnt offering, were about devotion, worshiping God.
Okay.
But others, the sin offering and the guilt offering, those were specifically about sin, atonement,
Hold on. Atonement. I need a little help with that.
Sure.
That's a big word.
That's a pretty weighty concept, yeah. Atonement, it basically means like covering or reconciliation. It's recognizing that when we sin, it separates us from God.
Okay, got it.
The sacrifices, the blood, all that symbolize the cost of sin and the need for someone to bear that cost. A substitute, so to speak.
So like a symbolic swap.
Right.
An innocent animal's life in place of the person who sinned.
Precisely. And it mattered where these sacrifices happened within the tabernacle, like the burnt offering, the one focused on worship.
Yeah.
That was done outside on the altar. But the sin offering and the guilt offering, they were brought inside, closer to the Holy of Holies.
Wait, different spots for different offerings?
Yeah.
What's with all the like layers? Why the separation?
Because it's about getting closer to God's presence.
Yeah.
The offerings about worship, those happen further away. But dealing with sin, that was a whole other level. You had to bring those offerings inside, closer to where God's presence was the strongest, in the Holy of Holies.
Okay, I think I'm following. So let's talk about the Holy of Holies. Like, what made this inner sanctum whatever so special?
Well, think about it. Only the high priest could enter this place. And even he could only go in once a year, on the Day of Atonement. That's where they kept the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh, wow, the Ark of the Covenant. Like Indiana Jones.
Right.
What was the big deal with that thing?
It was way more than just some treasure chest. It held the 10 Commandments. It represented the covenant, God's promise to his people. It being inside the Holy of Holies meant that was the very heart of God being with them.
Man, it's like meanies on top of meanies.
Layers, yeah.
So the tabernacle, that's God's dwelling. The Holy of Holies, that's the heart of that dwelling. And the Ark of the Covenant, that's like the bedrock of the whole relationship between God and his people. Intense.
And don't forget the context here. These people had just escaped slavery in Egypt. They were wandering in the desert, vulnerable, no clue where they fit in the world.
Oh, yeah, good point.
So the tabernacle was this constant reminder that God was right there with them, guiding them. And it gave them a way to come to him, even with all their, imperfections.
I get it, but still. It's a lot of rules, a lot of rituals. Do they really understand like the deeper stuff behind all of it?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's something we should look at more closely. When we get into the specifics of the offerings and that Day of Atonement ritual,
Okay, I'm with you.
the key is to see how all this physical stuff, it was like a shadow, a hint of something much bigger spiritually that was still to come.
All right, you've got me hooked. Let's chase those shadows and see where they lead.
So, like we were saying, the tabernacle wasn't just some random tent, right? It was carefully designed, packed with meaning. And those sacrifices were a big part of how the Israelites connected with God. So, ready to dive into some of the details?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
I'm especially curious about the different offerings happening in different places within the tabernacle. What was up with that?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Remember how we talked about the burnt offerings? The ones mostly about worship and devotion?
Right, those happened outside.
Exactly, on that altar outside. But when it came to sin, things got a little more, how should I put it? Personal.
Personal, how so?
Well, you see, sin, it's like this barrier between us and God, right? So to really deal with it, you had to get closer, right into the heart of God's dwelling.
I'm with you. So the sin offering and the guilt offering were inside, near to the Holy of Holies. But what was it actually like? I mean, did people just stroll in and plop down their offering?
Not quite. There was a whole process, a ritual. Leviticus chapters 4 and 5, those lay out the specifics. Whoever brought the offering, they'd lay their hands on the animal, transferring their sin onto it.
Wow.
Then the animal was killed, and its blood was sprinkled or poured out in certain spots, depending on what kind of sin they were dealing with.
Wait, blood sprinkled around? That's kind of intense.
It was supposed to be. Remember, back then, blood represented life. Shedding blood, that was a big deal. It showed that sin has consequences, like life or death stuff. But the sacrifice, it also showed that forgiveness was possible. Reconciliation,
Right.
That animal's life, the innocent one, it was given in place of the sinner, a way to cover their mess up.
That's almost like a sneak peek of what Jesus would do.
Yeah.
Right? Offering his own life as the ultimate sacrifice for sin.
You got it. The whole sacrificial system with all its rituals and symbols, it was all pointing to Jesus' coming. It was a shadow, a preview of the perfect sacrifice that would totally close the gap between us and God.
So if each sacrifice was like a little preview, what about the Day of Atonement? The one that happened once a year?
Ah, yes, that's in Leviticus 16. That day was like the grand finale of the whole system. It was a national purification, a day for the high priest to go into the Holy of Holies and make atonement for everyone's sins, the whole nation's.
Talk about pressure. What did that even look like?
Well, it was a whole ceremony. First, the high priest would offer a bull, a sin offering for himself and his family. Then he'd take 2 goats, one for the Lord and one called the scapegoat. They'd draw lots to decide which was which.
Hold on, a scapegoat? What's that all about?
It's a really interesting idea. The high priest would confess everyone's sins, the whole nation, over the scapegoat's head, putting all their guilt onto it. Then they'd send the goat out into the wilderness, taking all the sins away with it.
So the goat took the fall for everyone. But what about the other goat? The one for the Lord?
That one was sacrificed. A sin offering. They sprinkled its blood on the mercy seat, on the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies. It was like covering the nation's sins before God.
It's so much symbolism packed into that. What stands out to you?
For me, it's how seriously they took God's holiness and how bad sin really is. Even the high priest, the best guy around, he had to deal with his own sin first before going to God for the people. That tells you something.
It really shows how big that gap is between us and God, like we talked about, and that we need something, some way to bridge it.
Exactly. The sacrifices, they were a temporary fix, a cover-up. But they were always pointing to a real lasting solution. They were a promise that one day the perfect sacrifice would happen, once and for all, to fix things between people and God forever.
So the tabernacle, the offerings, the Day of Atonement, it wasn't about keeping an angry God happy or just following rules for no reason. It was about getting closer to God, seeing sin for what it is, and waiting for the answer to the sin problem.
You said it. And when we get to the New Testament, we'll see how all this comes together in Jesus. He's the ultimate high priest, the perfect sacrifice, the one who bridges the gap between us and God for good.
Okay, so we've been on this wild ride. We talked about the tabernacle, the sacrifices, all those details, and how they pointed to something bigger coming. Now we're in the New Testament. This is where, all that foreshadowing, it meets Jesus, right?
Yeah, it's amazing, really. Everything we've talked about, God's dwelling, needing atonement, the high priest's job, it all comes together in Jesus. He's like the whole point of what the tabernacle and the rituals were trying to show us.
Okay, so how does that work? How does Jesus fulfill all that Old Testament stuff?
Oh, remember the high priest going into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. He was the go-between, right?
Yeah. Between
God and the people, offering sacrifices to cover their sins. Hebrews 4:1-4 to 16 tells us that Jesus is our high priest. But, he's not stuck in the earthly tabernacle. He goes into the heavenly one and offers himself as, the perfect sacrifice.
So it's like Jesus is a high priest, but, cosmic level, not just some tent, but like heaven's sanctuary.
Yeah.
But what's so different about his sacrifice?
Yeah.
How's it different from the animal sacrifices?
That's the big thing. Jesus' sacrifice, it's complete, it's final. Those animal sacrifices, they were a temporary fix, like putting a Band-Aid on sin. But they couldn't really get rid of it. Hebrews 9:1 says, Jesus went into the most holy place just once, for good. Not with goat blood or calf blood, but with his own blood. Eternal redemption, that's what he got.
So it's not just like where it happened or what was sacrificed. It's who was sacrificed.
Right.
Jesus, God and man, he offered something priceless, something that could actually pay for every sin forever.
Exactly. And this whole thing, it wasn't random. John 17, it's called the high priestly prayer. It shows us how much Jesus wanted to fix what went wrong back in the garden. He wanted us to have that close relationship with God again, like it was supposed to be.
And that's where the whole God's dwelling idea comes full circle, right? It's not a building anymore. It's about God living inside us through the Holy Spirit. And we get that because of what Jesus did.
You got it. 1 Corinthians 6:19, it says our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. He's in us. God gave him to us. So we're like walking tabernacles, right? A place for God to live.
Oh, that's a heavy thought. So that whole story that started with the tabernacle way back when, it ends up with God living inside each person who believes. Makes us part of his forever home. It's like the tabernacle, it got bigger and bigger until it's like the whole world.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. And this idea, this God living in us thing, it changes everything. How we live, how we treat each other, how we see ourselves in the universe.
So what does it all mean for us now? We don't have a tabernacle to go to, but we have God with us right here inside, thanks to the Holy Spirit. So how does that change things? How we worship, how we do community, our purpose, all that. What are the shadows we're living in now? What future are they pointing to? I guess that's something for all of us to think about as we keep going on our own, faith journey.
For sure. That tabernacle and all those rituals, they're in the past. But the truths they showed us, those never get old. They matter forever. We got to keep digging into the Bible, let the Holy Spirit show us what it means. There's so much more to discover about where God dwells, both inside us and all around us.